to say about me. I love to sing and I love women.
He was the coolest man in the room, and he never seemed to try. A drink in one hand, a cigarette in the other, a smile that made the hardest nights in Las Vegas feel like a party among old friends. Dean Martin built an entire career on looking like nothing could touch him. But the real story of his final years is nothing like the character he played on stage. It is a story of buried grief, quiet withdrawal, failing health, and a devotion between two people who could never quite stay together, yet never truly let go of each other either. This is a story of how the King of Cool's charmed life slowly came apart, and how the woman who loved him longest stood beside him until the very end. Before there was a legend, there was a kid from a steel town who barely spoke English until he started grade school. Dino Paul Crocetti grew up in a working-class Italian household in eastern Ohio, in a home filled with a language that made him an outsider the moment he stepped into an American classroom. Other children mocked the way he spoke. Teachers grew frustrated with him. By his teenage years, school had become something to escape rather than endure, and he walked away from it before finishing. What followed was a string of jobs that paid little and asked much. Pumping gas, delivering milk, working behind a counter. None of it satisfied him. And for a while he tried his hand at boxing, taking beatings for a few dollars a fight under a ring name that hid his identity from his disapproving father. It was brutal, unglamorous work, and it left him with permanent physical reminders long after he'd hung up the gloves. It was almost by accident that singing entered his life, in the back rooms of an illegal gambling operation where he worked as a dealer. Between hands of cards, he began to sing for the regulars, and something in his voice caught the attention of people who could actually do something with it. A band leader gave him a shot, an opera-inspired stage name followed, and eventually a mentor convinced him to simplify it into something audiences could remember: Dean Martin. The rest, as they say, would become history. But underneath the polish, he carried the same guarded, private nature he'd had as a bullied child who didn't feel like he belonged. The 1940s and 1950s turned Dean into one of the most bankable entertainers in America. His partnership with young, manic comedian brought him fame beyond anything a nightclub singer could have dreamed of, filling movie theaters and television screens for a decade. When that partnership fractured under the weight of ego, resentment, and creative frustration, most people assumed Dean's career would fade quietly into the background. Instead, he reinvented himself as a solo star, then as a member of the most famous group of entertainers of the era, headlining Las Vegas alongside some of the biggest names in show business. Audiences believed they were watching a man half drunk, half awake, cracking jokes about women and whiskey between songs. In truth, it was a carefully rehearsed persona. The glass in his hand was often filled with something far weaker than liquor, and the stumbling, loose delivery was performance technique borrowed and perfected, not a genuine reflection of how much he drank. Dean was, by most accounts of people who worked closely with him, one of the most disciplined and punctual professionals in the business, a man who understood exactly what the audience wanted and delivered it night after night without fail. He eventually landed his own long-running television variety show, a program built entirely around his effortless charm. He refused to rehearse, insisted on working only one day a week, and somehow the whole thing worked anyway, drawing tens of millions of viewers for the better part of a decade. To the public, he was untouchable, rich, funny, adored, and seemingly immune to the pressures that broke other stars. Behind the cameras, his personal life told a very different story. Dean's romantic life was as complicated as his public image was simple. His first marriage in the early 1940s gave him 4 children and years of quiet domestic life before it ended in divorce at the close of the decade. Within days of that divorce becoming final, he married again, this time to a former beauty queen who would remain his wife for nearly a quarter of a century and give him 3 more children. For most of the 1950s and 1960s, this second marriage anchored him. His wife managed a household of 7 children while he toured, filmed, and performed constantly, building the fortune and fame that defined the Rat Pack era. Publicly, they were held up as one of Hollywood's golden couples. Privately, the demands of his career, his frequent absences, and rumors of infidelity slowly wore the relationship down. By the end of the 1960s, the marriage had quietly disintegrated, and the couple separated in 1969. finalizing their divorce a few years later. A third marriage followed almost immediately, a much shorter union to a Beverly Hills hairdresser that lasted only a handful of years before ending in the mid-1970s. Dean adopted his third wife's daughter during that marriage, but the relationship itself never had the depth of his earlier ones. When it ended, something in Dean seemed to close off. He never married again for the remaining 2 decades of his life. Instead, in the years that followed, he drifted back toward the one woman who had shared the longest and most formative stretch of his adult life, his second wife. If there was a single moment that broke something permanent in Dean Martin, it came in March of 1987. His son from his second marriage, a promising young man who had followed a very different path into military aviation, was killed when his fighter jet crashed into a mountainside during a training exercise. He was only 35 years old. The devastation was immediate and, according to almost everyone who knew him, permanent. Friends and family who had known Dean for decades described a man who simply stopped being fully present after that day. He withdrew from a reunion tour he had been doing with 2 of his closest friends and longtime collaborators, walking away partway through and effectively ending decades of professional camaraderie overnight. The distance this created between him and his old friends took years to heal, and by the time it did, much of the joy had already drained out of those relationships. It was in this period of unbearable grief that his second wife stepped back into his life in a way she hadn't in years. Though their marriage had ended, their bond as parents who had lost a child together proved stronger than the bitterness of divorce. She became one of the very few people Dean allowed close to him during this time, a steady presence who understood exactly what he had lost because she had lost it too. Those who observed them together in this period often remarked that whatever anger had once existed between them had been replaced by something quieter and more resigned. 2 people bound by shared grief who would simply run out of reasons to stay apart, even if remarriage was never on the table again. The years following his son's death were marked by a steady retreat from the public eye. The man who had once filled Las Vegas showrooms night after night began turning down engagements. He still occasionally appeared for old friends or one-off performances, but the spark that once made him seem born for the stage had visibly dimmed. People who worked with him during the stretch noted that he would still crack a joke or offer a warm word, but it increasingly felt like an echo of a performance he no longer had his heart in. Drinking, which had always been more theater than truth during his younger years, reportedly became more real as the grief settled in. Longtime friends and collaborators who had known him since the early days observed that whatever restraint he'd shown in decades past seemed to loosen considerably after 1987. He stopped chasing the spotlight entirely, preferring quiet dinners with a small circle of trusted friends over industry events or interviews. The man once famous for owning every room he walked into now seemed to actively avoid rooms altogether. By the early 1990s, decades of heavy smoking had caught up with him physically. He was diagnosed with lung cancer, and doctors reportedly urged him to consider treatment that might extend his life. Dean, by most accounts, chose not to pursue aggressive intervention, a decision that friends attributed less to fear and more to a sense that he had already said his goodbyes to the parts of life that had once mattered most to him. He retreated almost entirely to his home in Beverly Hills, away from cameras, away from fans, away from the stage that had once felt like the only place he truly knew how to be himself. Dean Martin died at his Beverly Hills home on Christmas Day, 1995, from complications related to his lung disease. He was 78 years old. The news rippled across the entertainment world instantly, a reminder that one of the last living connections to the golden age of Las Vegas entertainment was gone. In a gesture rarely afforded entertainers, the lights along the Las Vegas Strip, the city he had helped define for a generation of performers, were dimmed in his memory, a silent tribute to a man who had given the city so much of its identity. His funeral drew an extraordinary gathering of Hollywood figures, but by every account of those who attended, the ceremony itself remained understated, much like the man being honored. Amid the many famous faces in the room, it was reportedly a simple musical tribute from a close family friend, performed quietly during the service, that left the deepest impression on those present. It served as a reminder that beneath the legendary persona was simply a father who never fully recovered from losing his son, and a friend who had spent his final years choosing solitude over the spotlight he had once commanded so effortlessly. He was laid to rest at a cemetery in Los Angeles, his crypt inscribed with a line borrowed from the song that had become inseparable from his identity as an entertainer, a final, fitting echo of the voice that had defined him. His second wife, the woman who had stood beside him to the height of his fame, raised his children, endured their painful divorce, and returned to comfort him through the darkest years of his life, outlived him by more than 2 decades. She never remarried after their split, choosing instead to live a comparatively quiet life away from the industry that had once made them one of its most glamorous couples. Her later years were marked by their own private sorrow. In 2016, just months before her own death, she lost another son from her marriage to Dean, a musician who had spent years performing in tribute to his father's legacy. She herself passed away later that same year in Beverly Hills, after a long battle with cancer, at the age of 89. In many ways, her death closed the final chapter of a family whose public image had always suggested effortless glamour, but whose private reality had been shaped by loss after loss, grief that outlasted fame that had once seemed to define them. What makes Dean Martin's story so quietly devastating is the gap between the image and reality. For decades, audiences believed they were watching a carefree entertainer who floated through life untouched by hardship, a man whose greatest struggle was deciding which joke to tell next. The truth was a man shaped early on by isolation and hardship, who built an entire persona as a kind of armor, and who, when real tragedy finally struck in the form of his son's death, found that the armor could not protect him from grief the way it had protected him from criticism or failure. He gave audiences decades of music, laughter, an image of effortless cool that still defines an era of American entertainment. But behind that easy smile was a man who buried enormous pain quietly, who chose solitude over spectacle in his final years, and who found what comfort he could in the company of the woman who had shared the most significant chapters of his life, even after their marriage had ended. Their story was never a simple one of happily ever after. It was something messier and in many ways more human. Two people who loved deeply, hurt each other, drifted apart, and ultimately found their way back to each other when it mattered most, standing together in the shadow of a loss neither of them ever fully recovered from. Dean Martin's legend endures in reruns, records, and the songs still played at weddings and holiday gatherings decades after his death. But the real story, the one behind the microphone and the martini glass, is a far more sobering reminder that even the most seemingly unshakable stars carry private sorrows that the spotlight never reveals. What do you think stayed with Dean Martin most in those final years? The loss of his son, or the quiet return of the woman who understood that loss better than anyone else? Share your thoughts below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more stories from the golden age of Hollywood.